Hello and welcome. I'm Tom Burges Watson. You are watching W News, broadcasting live from the Arabiya News headquarters. These are our top stories. Kamala Harris rallies in Houston as both candidates competing for the White House take their campaigns to Texas. Donald Trump travels to Austin in a bid to resonate with younger male voters, as polls show the race is on a knife edge. And Antony Blinken holds talks with the Lebanese Prime Minister as Washington urges Israel to limit its military campaign against Hezbollah. Welcome. We begin with the latest on the US election. And Donald Trump is visiting Texas today to record an episode of the Joe Rogan Experience, the most popular podcast in the country. Well, the appearance reflects a strategic move by the Trump campaign, aiming to connect with younger male audiences through podcasts instead of traditional media. Well, his Democratic opponent, Kamala Harris, is also in Texas, taking her campaign to Houston, where she's expected to be endorsed by a lineup of musical stars. Well, it is the race to the finish line for the US presidential candidates, Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, who are squeezing in as many swing rally states as they can ahead of the 5th of November. Well, the former president has been honing his criticism of his opponent's border policy, while Vice President Kamala Harris has lined up politicians, actors and musicians to elevate her message. Our correspondent Caroline Malone has more.
Legendary US rocker Bruce Springsteen pumped up the crowds in swing state Georgia on Thursday night. Known as a great songwriter, he used lyrics and a speech to make a clear case for Kamala Harris.
I want a president who reveres the Constitution, who does not threaten but wants to protect and guide our great democracy, who believes in the rule of law and the peaceful transfer of power.
Harris is not short on star-studded support. Former President Barack Obama by her side, warning people off her political opponent.
What I cannot understand is why anybody would think that Donald Trump will shake things up in a way that is good for you.
Just 12 days left in one of the most consequential elections of our lifetime.
The consequences are potentially huge, and Trump knows it too. From Las Vegas, Nevada, he is hyping up his plans for no tax on tips, a popular message among the people here who work in the service industry. And he's also insisting he'll increase tariffs if he gets re-elected.
We will make America safe again. And we will make America great again. God bless you, Nevada. God bless you.
Trump attracted big crowds. He's due later on Joe Rogan's popular podcast to try and engage more young male voters. Harris had her biggest rally yet, with 20,000 people turning up in Georgia, which may only be surpassed by plans for a mega Texas rally on Friday evening, in which Beyoncé is tipped to perform. Harris is gaining support among white women and Trump among Hispanic men. But overall, it's a dead heat in the popular vote, according to a final poll by the New York Times and Siena College. There is still everything to play for. Caroline Malone, Arabiya News, Washington.
Well, for more, we can cross to Austin, Texas, and speak to our correspondent, Toni, who's standing by for us. Toni, great to have you with us. Just let's start by talking about Donald Trump there in Texas. What's he doing there?
Well, Tom, by no stretch of the imagination is Texas a swing state. So the fact that we have two presidential candidates stopping here on Friday, just 11 days before the election, really tells us something. And for Donald Trump, that something is young male voters. This is a growing and targeted demographic of his campaign. And he's going to be doing this interview with Joe Rogan, who hosts one of the most popular podcasts in the United States. He has more than 52 million subscribers, many of them young right-leaning men, and this is the audience that Trump is targeting. They tend to be low-propensity voters, so he's really trying to get this message out for them to go and vote. And in fact, there was a Reuters Ipsos poll that came out earlier today showing that Trump now trails Harris by just 2 percentage points when it comes to Hispanic men, 44 to 46%. Back in 2020, Trump had a 19-point deficit compared to Joe Biden among the same demographics. So he is gaining a lot of ground when it comes to Hispanic voters, when it comes to black voters, young male voters overall. And part of the reason is his messaging. He's been talking a lot about the economy, about inflation, and also immigration. This is a winning issue for the Republicans. It is really seen as Kamala Harris's biggest political vulnerability, and Texas is on the front lines of the immigration debate. We are a border state. We have the longest border with Mexico, and this was really ground zero when we had those record migration crossings in the past year. So this is a place where he can get his message across, not to just Hispanic and black voters in Texas, but really a broader message out to the rest of the United States.
Okay, so that's Donald Trump in Texas and what he's doing there. What's Kamala Harris doing there?
Yeah, I mean, as much as this is not a swing state, this is a solidly Republican state. So Kamala Harris being here is about also sending a message. And her message to voters is really to paint Texas as the extreme example when it comes to abortion access in America. Texas has some of the strictest abortion bans in the country. There are no exceptions for rape or incest. The only exception is to save the life of a mother. But the criteria around that is very ill-defined. And we have seen women being turned away at emergency rooms, at hospitals, from doctors' offices when they are miscarrying because doctors are so scared to perform an abortion on them. And the reason is because doctors, if they are convicted of performing an illegal abortion, they face up to 99 years in prison, which has really had a chilling effect across the state. We used to have 4,400 abortions take place on average every single month. That is now down to 7. And the message that Kamala Harris is trying to send out to voters is that if Trump is reelected, there will be 50 Texases in the United States when it comes to access to abortion care. She's also here stumping for Democratic Congressman Colin Allred, who is in this very tight race to unseat the Republican Senator Ted Cruz. And this is really seen as the only state right now where Democrats even have the slightest chance of flipping a Senate seat, which would be pivotal for the Democrats. And certainly if Kamala Harris is elected, she's going to need the full support of the Senate. So she's also here for that reason. And as you mentioned, Beyonce is meant to be showing up. She's going to be performing. There's been a lot of rumors swirling that she was going to be part of this campaign. But for those diehard country, old school fans, Willie Nelson is also going to be on hand tonight.
Yeah, there's going to be a lot of stars out there on the stage. You mentioned a couple of the most important issues on voters' minds there: immigration, abortion. There's another issue as well, of course, the economy. I mean, in what order would you put those issues as far as voters are concerned? What's the most important things on voters' minds right now?
Well, what we have seen consistency in the polling is that the economy is the top issue for voters this election cycle. It has to do with inflation. We saw very high inflation rates after the pandemic. Housing has become unaffordable for a lot of people, particularly for young people who are starting off in life and want to buy their first home. So that is by far across the country the most pressing issue. This is an issue that people feel and experience on a daily basis when they are at the grocery store, when they are at retail stores, when they are filling up their cars with petrol. So this is the top issue. Immigration, though, is also very much a top issue. And I have to say that part of the reason is because it is no longer a border state issue. So it's always been something that voters have considered in those places that are directly up against Mexico. But something that the governor here in Texas has done over the last 2 years is that he has been busing migrants from the Texas border up into what are considered to be sanctuary cities, often very liberal Democratic cities up in the west of the country, in the northeast of the country, places where you don't have tens of thousands of people crossing into the state without any resources on a daily basis. And this has really opened up the issue, I think, to a lot of voters in these more northern states that really hadn't considered it in the same way, because now their infrastructure is being stressed. Their healthcare systems are being stressed. Their school systems are being stressed because of the influx of these migrants. And then I would think after that we would get abortion. Of course, you have a very strong anti-abortion group here in the United States. They will always be anti-abortion. But for a lot of women, this is a crucial issue, even for moderate Republican women. Women need to have access to this type of reproductive care. And of course, the larger concern for some of these women is that whatever happens on the abortion front could just be the tip of the iceberg, that we could really start seeing IVF and contraception next in line.
Okay, and just lastly, Toni, I mean, looking at what happened last time, there was a transition of power in the United States. There was violence, wasn't there? And there must be concerns of that risk of violence once again overshadowing the democratic process. Toni?
Yeah, there absolutely is this concern. The FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, issued a bulletin quite recently warning of the potential for political violence from extremists who have these election-related grievances. This is a very divided, split country right now. So no matter who wins on November 5th, you're going to have half of the population very unhappy with that decision. And speaking to experts, they have been telling me that political violence in the United States right now is at its highest sustained level since the 1970s. The big difference being that in the 1970s, when you had mostly left-leaning extremists, they were targeting institutions and buildings. And what we have been seeing in January 6th and other instances, we're seeing more right-leaning extremists targeting people, fellow Americans.
This nondescript building in Phoenix, Arizona, is where election ballots are counted. It's normally quiet.
Count the legal votes.
But in the days following the 2020 elections, it became a hotbed of contention. False claims of election fraud spurred violent threats and armed protests, the workers inside fearing for their safety. When the counting starts this year, election workers will be behind bulletproof glass, 2 layers of fencing, and even more security cameras.
This is to keep the people working in this building safe, to keep the ballot safe, but also to give a clear direction for individuals who want to come out and express their First Amendment right, where they can go, where the limits are.
U.S. officials say threats and acts of violence against public servants are at unprecedented levels. Data shows that threats against members of Congress have jumped 700% since 2016. Federal judges, 160%. While nearly 40% of local election officials say they've experienced threats, harassments, or abuse for doing their jobs.
Every day we receive threats from people calling saying, I know you're going to steal the election, or people calling or sending emails or voicemails, or in some cases even showing up on our homes to threaten us or to scare us.
According to U.S. law enforcement officials, soft targets for political violence could include campaign events, ballot drop box locations, and political rallies. Some voting centers have even installed panic buttons, giving workers a direct line to the police.
Experts say the internet has allowed misinformation and conspiracy theories around election fraud to spread rapidly. But despite the high-pitched rhetoric, some research shows that extremist group mobilization has nearly halved since 2020.
There's a variety of explanations. The leading one is probably the law enforcement crackdown following the Capitol riots in 2021. Many of these groups were either decapitated or had their leadership substantially imprisoned. And the groups may continue to fear law enforcement crackdown thereafter.
Even if Election Day goes off without a hitch, some worry that any delays or questions over the results could trigger violence. And with places like Arizona already warning it could take up to 13 days to count the votes, election officials are preparing for the worst. Toni Waterman, Arabiya News, Austin.
Well, let's stay with the US election and get some more analysis now with the Pulitzer Prize-winning author and professor of law at the Rochester Institute of Technology, David K. Johnston. Thank you very much indeed for being with us. Interesting, isn't it? We got both candidates in Texas today. I mean, let's be clear, there's no illusion here that Texas remains a safely red state, doesn't it?
I don't know if it's safely red at this point. It's possible that Colin Allred, the Democratic candidate for the U.S. Senate, will defeat Ted Cruz, who's personally very unpopular and has done some things that upset Texas residents. For example, going on vacation to Mexico when there was a freeze, an extraordinary event in Texas in which a number of people died. But not most likely it will remain a red state.
Okay, I mean, the gap has been narrowing, though, hasn't it, in Texas over the last couple of decades? I mean, do you think it's fair to call it a purple state, then?
I don't think we really know. One of the problems in America is that I'm not sure the polls are reliable. Many of the polls are finding that fewer than 1 in 100 people who answer the telephone will answer the questions. And I think that suggests a self-selection bias that may not give us reliable polling information, even though many of the polls seem reasonably consistent.
Yeah, they are pretty tight, aren't they? And if nothing else, what we can draw from the polls, when you look at the latest New York Times poll, for example, 48 and 48. I mean, there's really nothing in it. That's today's poll. One thing that's looking increasingly likely as a scenario, isn't it, is that on the 5th of November, we probably won't get an answer, will we?
Probably not on the Electoral College. Kamala Harris will win the popular vote, and I predict she'll win it by more than 10 million votes, just as Biden won by 7 million and Hillary Clinton by more than 3 million. But Americans do not elect their president by popular vote. They elect them by states through something called the Electoral College. So really are only 7 states that matter in this presidential election, and we don't know how that's going to turn out.
Okay, and if that latest poll is accurate, 48-48, it tells us something we've been talking about for a long time, covering US elections. The United States is a deeply divided country. Does it look more deeply divided now than it did, say, last time the country went to the polls?
Yes, and I frankly find all of this quite surprising as someone who's been through many elections as a journalist, because we have one candidate who is a convicted felon who has announced he will be dictator on day one, but then he'll give it up, who has called for suspending the Constitution and for arresting his opponents. Anything in any previous election before Donald Trump, that would have disqualified you, and yet he has tens of millions of supporters, very ardent supporters.
Yeah, I was going to say, unprecedented in so many ways, especially when you look at the language that's being bandied around. We've had Kamala Harris calling her running mate, her rival on the campaign, a fascist yesterday. He's calling her stupid and lazy. I mean, this is really atypical, isn't it?
This is like junior high school. Back in 1988, I wrote that Donald Trump might become president of the United States. And I've followed him all the years since then, when I was at the Philadelphia Inquirer, when I was at the New York Times, and since. And he is behaving as I predicted that he would. I think what's fascinating is the reaction of so many Americans. And Mitt Romney, who was the Republican presidential candidate 16 years ago, has said he believes Trump's success is because millions of members of his party, the Republican Party, do not believe in democracy and do not believe in the Constitution. And indeed, there are a lot of people saying what America needs is a dictator.
Okay, well, on a slightly brighter note, and turning our eye back to Texas, there's quite a lot of stars being wheeled out to cheer on the candidates. Beyonce on Team Harris, and Beyonce will be taking the stage. Do you think, these stars like Taylor Swift and some of the others that have come out in favor of Kamala Harris, and there have been stars that have come out in favor of Donald Trump as well, Hulk Hogan, Elon Musk, to name just 2. Do you think they make much of a difference?
Not really. The difference between the 2 candidates is that Kamala Harris's supporters, like Taylor Swift, are themselves incredibly popular, and Taylor Swift has been responsible for more than 400,000 young people going and registering to vote. The people supporting Donald Trump from the entertainment world are rather minor characters in comparison, but I don't think that has much of an effect, and it's certainly not about the policy issues that should be the center of a presidential election.
Okay, so possibly a bit of mobilization, but not much more than that, you're saying, Professor.
Enthusiasm and getting people to turn out. That's the point of having movie and TV and singing stars support you.
Okay, maybe getting people to the rallies as well. Maybe Beyonce's a little bit of an extra crowd drawer there in Texas as well. Another type of endorsement comes from the newspapers. The New York Post firmly on Team Trump. In the headlines as well, the LA Times and the Washington Post. And they're in the headlines because neither is committing to either candidate. Why don't you think that they're doing that?
I think it's pretty clear that the physician who owns the Los Angeles Times now, where I also work, simply doesn't want to get into this. He has some very strong views. The paper did a huge self-expose of its history of racist and discriminatory policies, but he's been much more tepid on the editorial page. And at the Washington Post, I think it's the same thing with Jeff Bezos, the founder of Amazon. But let's keep in mind that the editorial page belongs to the publisher, and he or she can do whatever they please on the editorial page. Neither of these publishers or owners has interfered in any way in the news coverage. And in fact, they have poured money into and been very supportive of news coverage in all sorts of areas, including the election.
So do you think it will make much of a difference, the fact that these two much read publications are not, as they have done in previous years, committing to either candidate?
Yeah, you know, I've never in my 58-year career met somebody who said I changed my decision on who to vote for any election from city councilman to president because of a newspaper editorial. It may make the publisher feel good or the staff feel good if they like the publisher's choice, but I don't see them as having impact. What matters is turning out, knocking on doors, driving people if necessary to the polls, or making sure they fill out their mail-in ballot. It's voting at the end of the day that matters.
Okay, 12 days to go, just under, in fact. Where are you seeing the race heading? Do you think that the razor-thin element to the polling is going to remain a consistent theme for the next 11 days, or do you see the gap widening, and if so, why?
Well, that's where I don't trust the polls. When you have a response rate of less than 1 in 100, and in some polls less than 1 in 200, I'm not sure you're getting reliable results, even if you can check the boxes that you have the right number of people in each demographic for your poll. We've seen an enormous amount of early voting turnout. A lot of it's been by Republicans. And what we don't know is, are these Republicans who are going to vote for Kamala Harris because they can't stand Donald Trump, or are they going to vote for Donald Trump because they can't imagine having a woman in the White House?
Okay, well, we're going to have to leave it there. I'm being told we're out of time, but really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. Professor David K. Johnston, thank you very much indeed. Let's get a check of some other news stories we're following for you now. The US Justice Department has reached a $100 million settlement with the Singaporean operator of a cargo ship which destroyed a Baltimore bridge. Well, the settlement does not include any damages for the eventual reopening of the Francis Scott Key Bridge. Well, the families of 6 road workers who lost their lives are pursuing legal claims of their own. A Los Angeles County District Attorney has recommended that Eric and Lyle Menendez be resentenced over the murders of their parents. This is due to new evidence that's come to light. Well, the 1989 murders of Kitty and Jose Menendez in Beverly Hills have captivated the US and inspired a popular Netflix series. Well, for their release, a judge must approve the recommendation, followed by a parole board decision. The EU chief, Ursula von der Leyen, pledges 20 million euros in immediate aid for Bosnia, following on from deadly and devastating floods there. Earlier on this month, 27 people died in floods and landslides, which washed away infrastructure, cutting off many populated areas in central and southern Bosnia. And environmental campaigners in London have lost the legal challenge against the British government. They'd accused the government of failing to meet obligations to protect citizens from the effects of climate change. Well, a judge at the High Court in London ruled that the government's climate adaptation policy, drawn up by the previous Conservative government, was lawful. Well, the decision is expected to be appealed. And voters go to the polls in Georgia tomorrow as the ruling party Georgian Dream seeks a fourth term in office. Opinion polls show the party remains the country's most popular choice, though it has lost ground since 2020 when it won almost 50% of the vote and a narrow parliamentary majority. The US Secretary of State Antony Blinken has been holding talks in London with Lebanon's caretaker Prime Minister, as well as with the foreign ministers of the United Arab Emirates and Jordan. Well, Blinken is continuing to push for diplomatic solutions in the region. Well, the United States has expressed hopes for fresh Gaza ceasefire negotiations coming during the next few days. Well, Arabiya's Olly Barratt filed this report for us from London.
Well, Antony Blinken headed into talks with Lebanon's Prime Minister here in London off the back of a Middle East tour on which he had not been calling for an immediate ceasefire with regards to Israel's military campaign inside Lebanon, but he had been saying that the US did not want to see a protracted military operation inside Lebanon. As I say, he started his day here in London with that meeting with Lebanon's Prime Minister, at which Antony Blinken said that he thought there was a real urgency to find a diplomatic solution. The Secretary of State also calling for more to be done to protect civilians inside Lebanon as Israel carries out those strikes, those ongoing strikes against Hezbollah. Now, while meeting with Jordan's foreign minister, some strong words in that meeting here in London. Ayman Safadi describing the situation in Gaza thus: "We do see ethnic cleansing taking place," he said, "and that has got to stop." Now, that is a characterization that Israel would strongly deny. Jordan's foreign minister also described what he believes is the region on the brink, he says, of a regional war. Now, Antony Blinken, from his side, praised Jordan for what he described as its remarkable leadership role when it comes to the humanitarian response in the region. And heading into these discussions here in London today, the State Department had made it clear that meeting with the foreign ministers of Jordan and the UAE was partly because the US sees them as key partners when it comes to discussing the post-conflict situation for Gaza. Now, Antony Blinken came here to London, as I say, at the end of his first trip to the Middle East since the killing of Hamas chief Yahya Sinwar, which, while in the Middle East, Antony Blinken described as an important opportunity to try and move towards the end of the war in Gaza. Olly Barratt in London for Al Arabiya News.
To Russia now, and the 16th BRICS summit in the Russian city of Kazan has now wrapped up. Moscow says 36 countries and 6 international organizations were represented at the event, which was hosted by President Vladimir Putin. But the summit fell short of accepting some new members. That's despite dozens of applications, as our correspondent Dasha Chernyshova in Moscow now explains.
Over the 3 days of talks in Russia, leaders of the BRICS countries have discussed the group's vision for its own future. The first meeting of the group after it doubled in size set a membership process, inviting some 13 countries to become partner states first. Moscow noted eventual decision on the new members will require a consensus among BRICS states. The discussions also centered on the reform of global governance, the United Nations and Bretton Woods institutions. All that is supposed to serve the needs of the developing economies, with BRICS agreeing the next wave of economic growth will come from the global south. On the sidelines in the Russian city of Kazan, several bilateral meetings were held, including the first in 5 years, face-to-face between China's President Xi Jinping and Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Russian President Vladimir Putin met with almost all the leaders in Kazan to talk bilateral ties and international issues. The world leaders called for de-escalation in the Middle East and urged peaceful solution to the conflict in Ukraine. Dasha Chernyshova, Al Arabiya, Kazan.
Let's get a check of some business news stories we're following for you now. German business morale improved more than expected in the month of October. The German Institute for Economic Research said its business climate index edged up more than 1 point in October to 86.5, up from the previous month. While the recovery in business sentiment ends a 4-month streak of decline for what is Europe's largest economy. Russia's central bank has hiked interest rates to 21%. This takes the borrowing cost to its highest level in more than 20 years. Well, the central bank said the hike was needed to fight inflation, which stands at 8.4%, and it's been driven up by massive increases in state spending related to Moscow's Ukraine offensive. Beijing says it's going to offer the Taliban tariff-free access to certain sectors of its economy. China has been seeking to develop ties with the Taliban ever since they took control of Afghanistan in 2021. Well, Kabul has asked China to allow it to be part of the $62 billion China-Pakistan economic corridor, which connects the resource-rich Chinese region of Xinjiang to Pakistan's Arabian seaport of Gwadar. Here are a couple of sports news stories for you. A source close to the case has told the AFP news agency that Paris Saint-Germain will refuse to comply with an order to pay the league, for the league to pay Kylian Mbappe $59.5 million in back pay. Well, a French league appeals committee has attempted to mediate between Mbappe and the club, which he left this year. Well, Mbappe said the multi-million-dollar figure is made up of the final 3 months of his salary plus bonuses. And Real Madrid's Carlo Ancelotti says Barcelona's revival is not keeping him up at night. This ahead of Saturday's Clásico. Well, Real Madrid are unbeaten in 42 La Liga matches and can match Barcelona's all-time record of 43 if they avoid defeat. Well, Madrid saw off Barcelona in both of last year's La Liga Clásicos. Before we leave you, a reminder of our top stories. Kamala Harris rallies in Houston as both candidates competing for the White House take their campaigns to the U.S. state of Texas. Donald Trump travels to Austin in a bid to resonate with younger male voters as polls show the race is on a knife edge. And Antony Blinken holds talks with the Lebanese Prime Minister as Washington urges Israel to limit its military campaign against Hezbollah. Well, that is all we have time for. Coming up next is Riz Khan, and then at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time, do join Rosanna Lockwood for Global News Today, a wrap-up of top international news stories with exclusive insights and fresh perspectives from leading experts and influential decision makers. That's it from us. Thanks for watching.